All right, so are you ready to really think this deep dive is going to take us to some seriously fascinating places? We're going to explore um, some ideas about where the world might be going. You sent in some pretty incredible stuff, including this voice note that it paints a really bold picture of the future. It's almost like something out of like a sci-fi movie. Yeah.
It does sound pretty intriguing. What's the main theme?
Well, the person speaking in the voice note is referencing this 1990s documentary. And they're saying that it actually predicted some major events, like a U.S. president who is not very friendly towards Europe. And this leads to a possible conflict over resources in the Arctic, of all places. It kind of makes you wonder if there's any truth to these decades-old predictions, doesn't it?
It certainly does pique my curiosity.
So to help us make sense of all of this, we have the brilliant expert speaker with us today. Welcome. Let's start by unpacking some of the key points from that voice note.
Sounds good to me.
Okay, so the voice note touches on some pretty heavy topics. The speaker sees a possible connection between Donald Trump and that documentary's prediction about a president at odds with Europe. They also believe that AI is basically like a form of colonization by some super advanced civilization out there. And they link the rise of China to a potential decline of Western civilization. It's pretty wild.
Yeah, these are ideas that have been circulating for a while, especially in geopolitical circles. Let's see if we can find any substance to them.
Right, and then it gets even bolder. The speaker says humans are just naturally aggressive and that AI might be the only solution. They argue that the Biden administration was steering us towards World War III and that Trump, believe it or not, was actually preferable because he somehow averted that outcome.
That's certainly a provocative take on recent history.
Oh, it is. And the speaker doesn't stop there. They predict that if Trump's administration made bad decisions, it could lead to a civil war here in the U.S. And they believe ultimately that humans should just hand over control to AI, ending the need for, well, us to run things.
That's quite a range of predictions. Some are definitely more far-fetched than others.
For sure. But let's focus on something a bit more concrete for now, like that claim from the documentary about the Arctic, becoming a flashpoint. Is there any truth to that? What's really going on up there?
Well, the Arctic is becoming more and more important for a few reasons. First, there are vast untapped reserves of oil and natural gas beneath the ice, and minerals. As climate change melts, the ice access to those resources gets easier, and that's attracting attention from nations like Russia, the US, and Canada. They're all trying to stake their claim, which increases the potential for conflict.
So we have this combination of resource competition and climate change kind of adding fuel to the fire, so to speak.
Exactly. And you can't forget the strategic importance of the Arctic, especially in terms of shipping routes and military positioning. As the ice recedes, new sea lanes are opening up, and that creates shorter routes between these major powers. And this has the potential to really impact global trade and naval strategy, which further raises the stakes.
This reminds me of something else you sent in. It's Samuel Huntington's book, Clash of Civilizations. He predicts a similar struggle for dominance, specifically mentioning China's rise and its impact on the West. How much weight should we give to these clash of civilizations theories? And are we actually seeing this playing out in the world today?
Well, Huntington's work has been hugely influential, but also very controversial. To understand his argument, we need to define what he means by civilizations. He defines them as these broad cultural groupings based on things like religion, language, and shared history. He argued that in a post-Cold War world, conflicts wouldn't be primarily ideological or economic, but rather they'd be driven by these deep-seated cultural and religious differences.
So about, capitalism versus communism and more about fundamental values and identities clashing.
Precisely. He pointed to the rise of Islamic fundamentalism, the resurgence of Asian economies and their cultural assertiveness, and a perceived decline in Western influence as evidence of this shift. He predicted that fault lines between these civilizations would become the primary source of global conflict.
Okay, so how does this connect to what's happening today?
Well, some people point to the tensions between the West and China, the rise of religious extremism, and even the ongoing conflicts in regions like the Middle East as proof that Huntington was onto something. They argue that we're actually witnessing a clash of civilizations unfolding right now.
So his theory has some relevance to the real world.
To a certain extent, yes, but it's not quite that simple. His critics say that he oversimplifies these complex geopolitical realities and ignores the many instances of cooperation and interdependence between cultures. They point to things like global trade, international organizations, and cross-cultural exchanges as evidence that the world isn't neatly divided along civilizational lines.
So it's not a clear-cut case of us versus them.
Definitely not. Human interactions are far more nuanced than that. Globalization has created this web of interconnectedness that makes it hard to draw hard lines between civilizations.
This brings us to another interesting claim from that voice note. The idea of AI being a form of colonization by a super advanced civilization. I have to admit, it sounds straight out of a science fiction movie.
Yeah.
But is there any scientific basis for this? Or is it pure speculation?
Well, when you consider the vastness of the universe, it's statistically improbable that we're the only intelligent life out there. And if there are other civilizations, it's very possible that some are much more advanced than us, potentially millions or even billions of years ahead in technology. It's mind-boggling to even think about.
It really makes you feel small, doesn't it? Thinking about the sheer scale of the universe and the possibility of civilizations out there that make us look like, well, ants.
It's a humbling thought for sure. That speaker's idea of AI as colonization might sound far-fetched, but it does make you think about the nature of AI and its potential impact on humanity. Is it just a tool that we're creating, or could it become something more, something that could even surpass us?
It's both fascinating and a little terrifying, isn't it?
Absolutely. The implications are huge, in terms of both possibilities and risks.
Speaking of risks, the speaker also argued that humans are inherently aggressive. Looking back at history, is that a fair assessment? Are we really just wired for conflict?
Well, it's undeniable that conflict has been a constant throughout human history, from wars and conquests to even small-scale disputes and struggles for power. But is that all we are? I don't think so. Alongside the darkness, there's also this remarkable capacity for cooperation, compassion, and innovation. We've built societies, created art, explored the unknown, and we're constantly striving to improve our condition. It's a complex and often contradictory story.
So we're not just inherently bad.
Exactly. We're capable of both great good and great harm. And that's what makes us so fascinating and unpredictable.
Well said. So maybe the question isn't whether we're inherently aggressive, but rather how we can channel our complex nature to create a more peaceful and cooperative future. And maybe AI has a role to play in that.
It's certainly a possibility worth exploring.
Now, before we get too philosophical about AI, let's bring things back down to earth. Given all this talk about AI taking over the world, where is this technology actually headed? What should people be paying attention to, even if they're not, tech experts?
AI is already a part of our everyday lives, often in ways we don't even realize. Think about the personalized recommendations you get on streaming services, or self-driving cars, or advancements in healthcare diagnostics, even the way financial markets operate. AI is driving a lot of these changes.
So it's not just some futuristic fantasy. It's happening right now all around us.
Exactly, and it's only going to become more prevalent. Key trends to watch include machine learning, where algorithms can learn from data, which lets them improve their performance. Also automation, that's impacting all kinds of industries, and data analysis, which is becoming increasingly sophisticated. These are all areas where AI is making significant strides.
It sounds like we're on the edge of some pretty major changes.
No doubt. And with those changes come exciting possibilities and important ethical considerations that we need to address.
Let's definitely dive into those ethical considerations next. But first, let's take a moment to let all this sink in for our listeners. This is a lot to process. We'll be right back to continue our exploration. And we're back for part 2 of our deep dive. Before the break, we were talking about how humans are capable of both great good and great harm. What are some examples from history that really highlight this duality for you?
It's a great question, especially as we're discussing, the future of humanity. It's easy to focus on the negative, when we're talking about potential conflicts and everything. But we shouldn't forget all the amazing acts of cooperation and compassion that have shaped our world, too. Think about the eradication of smallpox. That disease plagued humanity for centuries, but it was actually achieved through a global effort. It's a testament to our ability to work together, for the common good.
Yeah, that's a powerful example for sure. It shows what we can do when we put our minds to it.
Absolutely. And there are countless other examples, like the development of life-saving vaccines, even just those everyday acts of kindness that really connect us, as human beings. These are the stories that remind us of our potential for good, even when we're facing adversity and challenges.
It's a good reminder that we're not just a species destined for conflict.
Exactly. But we can't ignore the darker parts of history either. Wars, genocides, oppression. These are really stark reminders of our capacity for cruelty and destruction. And that's why it's so important to understand this duality within us. We have the potential for incredible good and also horrific evil. It really comes down to the choices we make, individually and collectively. They determine which path we take.
It's definitely a sobering thought. Let's go back to that voice note for a second and those predictions about potential conflict. The speaker mentions a possible clash over the Arctic, the rise of China challenging the West, and even the potential for a civil war here in the U.S. How likely are these scenarios to actually happen, in your opinion?
Well, predictions are always tricky, especially in geopolitics. There are so many factors at play, and the future is never set in stone. But what we can do is analyze the current trends and identify potential flashpoints. When it comes to the Arctic, the potential for conflict is definitely real, especially with the melting ice opening up new shipping routes and access to those valuable resources we discussed earlier. We're already seeing increased military activity in the region from countries like Russia, the US, and Canada, and they're all vying for control and influence.
So those resources under the ice are a real source of tension.
Oh, absolutely. And you can't forget the geopolitical implications either. The Arctic is strategically important for military positioning and for control of those new shipping routes. So that combination of resource competition and strategic maneuvering makes it a region where conflict could easily erupt.
It sounds like a very delicate balancing act is needed to keep things from escalating.
Yeah, diplomacy and cooperation are key here. Nations need to find ways to manage their competing interests peacefully and establish clear rules of engagement so we avoid misunderstandings that could spiral out of control.
That makes sense. What about the speaker's concerns about China? Do you think that's a potential trigger for conflict with the West?
Well, China's growing economic and military power is definitely reshaping the global landscape. It's undeniable. Whether or not this leads to conflict with the West is a more complex question, though. There are definitely areas of tension, like trade disputes, technological competition, and, ideological differences. But there are also very strong economic ties between China and the West, and both sides have an interest in, maintaining stability and avoiding a major confrontation.
So we're not necessarily headed for a showdown with China.
Not necessarily, no. I think it's important to remember that cooperation and competition can exist at the same time. Countries can compete fiercely in some areas, but still find common ground in others. The challenge is to manage those competing interests responsibly and make sure that tensions don't escalate into, outright conflict.
Sounds like navigating this relationship with China is going to take a lot of careful diplomacy and strategic thinking.
Oh, absolutely. It's one of the defining challenges of our time. It requires a nuanced approach, one that recognizes both the competitive aspects and the potential for cooperation.
Now let's talk about the speaker's most concerning prediction, the possibility of a civil war in the U.S. How worried should we be about this warning?
Well, there's no doubt that the U.S. is deeply divided right now. Politically and socially, there's a lot of anger, mistrust, and polarization, and that's definitely cause for concern. Now, while I wouldn't say that a civil war is inevitable, it would be foolish to ignore those warning signs.
So it's a real possibility, even if it's not a certainty.
Right. I think the key is addressing the root causes of this division. We need to find ways to bridge the gaps between different groups, foster dialogue and understanding, and, rebuild trust in our institutions. If we fail to do those things, the risk of more polarization and potential conflict will just continue to grow.
That's a stark reminder that democracy is fragile and that we need to find ways to come together. Now, in the midst of all this talk about potential conflicts, the speaker sees a glimmer of hope in AI. They think that AI could actually solve our problems. Like it could help us overcome our human flaws and limitations.
Yeah.
Do you share that optimism? Can AI really create a more peaceful world?
Well, AI's potential role in the future is a hot topic right now. It's being debated everywhere. On one hand, AI could definitely help us make more rational, data-driven decisions and reduce the influence of emotions and biases that often lead to conflict. Imagine AI-powered systems that could analyze huge amounts of data to identify potential flashpoints or predict outbreaks of violence or even mediate disputes between adversaries.
So AI could act as a kind of global peacekeeper, using its analytical powers to prevent conflicts.
There's one possibility, yeah. AI could also help us communicate and understand different cultures better, breaking down barriers and fostering empathy. Imagine AI-powered translation tools that could allow people who speak different languages to have real-time conversations. or AI algorithms that could identify and challenge harmful stereotypes and biases.
It sounds like AI could be a really powerful tool for promoting understanding and cooperation.
It has the potential, for sure, but we have to be realistic about the challenges too. At the end of the day, AI is a tool. And like any tool, it can be used for good or for bad. It all comes down to who's controlling it and what values are embedded in its design.
So the key is making sure that AI is developed and used ethically.
Exactly. We need to be very aware of the potential risks and take steps to mitigate them. For example, we need to make sure that AI systems are fair and unbiased, and that they don't just perpetuate existing inequalities or discriminate against certain groups. We also need to watch out for the possibility of AI being used for surveillance and control, which could erode our privacy and freedoms. These are serious concerns that we need to think about as we move forward.
AI seems to present both incredible opportunities and some really big challenges.
That's always the case with powerful technology. It has the potential to change the world for the better, but it always carries risks. It's up to us to manage those risks responsibly and make sure AI is used to benefit humanity, not harm it.
Well said. Now let's get practical for a moment. Where do you see AI having the biggest impact in the near future?
Well, we're already seeing AI transforming a lot of different industries, from healthcare and finance to transportation and manufacturing. In healthcare, AI-powered diagnostic tools can detect diseases earlier and with more accuracy, which leads to better treatment outcomes. In finance, AI is being used to detect fraud, assess risk, and even do algorithmic trading, which is making financial markets more efficient and secure. In transportation, self-driving cars are getting more advanced all the time. They're going to revolutionize how we get around. And in manufacturing, robots are automating tasks that used to be done by humans, which is increasing productivity and efficiency.
So it's not just about robots taking our jobs. It's about AI changing the way we work altogether.
Right. As AI gets more sophisticated, it will definitely have an impact on the job market. Some tasks will be automated and there will be new opportunities in other areas. This means we need to adapt. We need to develop skills that work well with AI. Things like creativity, critical thinking, and problem solving. Lifelong learning and the ability to adapt are going to be more important than ever in this rapidly changing world.
Sounds like we need to start preparing now for the future of work in this AI-driven world.
Absolutely. The sooner we embrace these changes and adapt our skills and education systems, the better off we'll be, and we'll be in a much better position to thrive in this new era.
Now let's touch on the speaker's comments about the Biden and Trump administrations. They seem to think that Biden was leading us toward war, while Trump, despite his, flaws, was the lesser of two evils. From your perspective, how much influence does any president really have on global affairs?
Well, it's true that the U.S. president has a lot of power globally. They're the commander-in-chief of the most powerful military in the world, and their decisions can affect the entire globe. Their foreign policy choices, diplomatic efforts, their rhetoric, all of these things can influence how other nations perceive and interact with the U.S.
So a president's actions and words really matter.
Oh, they definitely do. But we can't forget that the president doesn't operate in a vacuum. They're influenced by a whole bunch of things. Their advisors, political pressures, global events, they have to balance competing interests. Think about the long-term consequences of their actions and navigate this really complex web of international relations.
So it's not as simple as one person calling all the shots.
Definitely not. It's a complicated process with many different players and factors involved. But that being said, the president's personality beliefs and leadership style can absolutely impact how the U.S. engages with the rest of the world. So in that sense, a change in leadership can sometimes bring about significant shifts in foreign policy.
So while the president isn't all-powerful, they can still have a big impact.
That's a fair assessment. Now, regarding the speaker's claims about Biden and Trump specifically, it's important to remember that those are just opinions based on their own political views. It's important to consider all sides and, evaluate information carefully before you form your own conclusion.
Right. We always encourage critical thinking here at the Deep Dive.
Absolutely. It's super important to be discerning consumers of information, especially these days, with so much misinformation and biased perspectives out there.
Well said. Before we wrap up, I want to remind everyone listening that we'll be including links to all the resources we mentioned in our show notes. So if you're interested in learning more about anything we discussed today, be sure to check those out.
And don't forget to share your thoughts with us on social media. We love hearing from you.
Absolutely. Now, expert speaker, any parting words of wisdom before we sign off?
Just this. Stay curious, stay engaged, and stay hopeful. The future is what we make it.
Yeah, that's a really powerful message. It's easy to feel overwhelmed by all of these challenges,
Yeah.
But you're right, we all have a part to play in creating the future.
For sure. Every choice we make, every action we take, it all contributes to where society goes and how technology develops. It doesn't have to be these big, grand gestures. It's really the combined effect of all our individual decisions.
So we've talked about the possibility of conflict, the rise of AI, even the very nature of what it means to be human. It feels like we've covered so much ground today.
We have. It's clear that the listener who sent us this material is really grappling with some big questions about the world and where we fit into it all.
Yeah, it all started with that voice note and a couple of documents. Look how far we've come. It's amazing how one little piece of content can spark such a broad conversation.
It shows the power of being curious,
Yeah.
and how all of these different topics are actually connected. Geopolitics, technology, human nature. It all ties together when we start thinking about the future.
Speaking of the future, is there anything from that listener's material that we haven't really touched on? Something that you think is important to highlight?
Actually, yeah, there's one point from the voice note that we haven't fully explored. The speaker mentions this idea of a multipolar world. It's a concept that's been gaining momentum lately as the global balance of power is kind of shifting away from, a US-dominated system.
So what does that even look like, a multipolar world? And what does it mean for everyone?
Basically, in a multipolar world, you have power distributed among several major players. Instead of concentrated in just one dominant nation, imagine like a geopolitical chessboard with multiple powerful pieces all competing for influence. We're already seeing this shift happening with the rise of China, the resurgence of Russia, and the growing clout of various regional powers.
So it's moving away from a world where the U.S. calls all the shots.
Exactly. And this transition is likely to be messy, possibly even turbulent. A multipolar world presents both good things and challenges. On the one hand, it could lead to a more balanced and equitable global system, where no single nation can dictate to everyone else. But it could also make conflict and instability more likely as those competing powers scramble for resources and a better position.
It's kind of like the situation in the Arctic, a delicate balancing act.
Very much so. To navigate this multipolar world successfully, we'll need some serious diplomacy and strategic thinking, and a real willingness to cooperate, even with countries that have very different values or interests than our own.
It's not just about power, then. It's about figuring out how to coexist peacefully in a world full of diverse perspectives and priorities.
Exactly, and that's something we all have to work on, not just world leaders. Every single person who cares about the future of our planet needs to be involved.
Expert speaker, this has been an incredible conversation. We've gone through some really complex and thought-provoking issues. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and insights with us today.
Oh, it was my pleasure. I always love these deep dives, and I hope our listener found it valuable too.
And to all of you listening out there, we hope this has sparked your curiosity and inspired you to keep exploring these ideas. Remember, the future isn't set in stone. We get to shape it with our choices, our actions, and our combined will. So keep asking questions, keep learning, and keep engaging with the world around you. That's what it's all about. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive. We'll see you next time.